Is Maine really the safest state to live in the United States? You may have heard a lot of people say that Maine is the safest state in America. And that really wouldn't be a surprise since, after all, it is surrounded by Canada, which is much safer than the United States. In fact, the state of Maine has 4 times more border with Canada than it does with the United States, but it still has some inner city problems in its larger cities. Maine has the 6th highest drug overdose death rate in the United States, and you may ask yourself, how can the safest state have the 6th highest drug overdose death rate? How can a state that's full of drug addiction be considered one of the safest places in America? Well, the simple answer is because of the metrics that are being used to consider crime rates, best or worst, usually favor white communities, and Maine has one of the highest percentages of white population in the United States. In fact, only about 4% of Maine's population is foreign born. Maine is the 4th whitest state, but that does not inherently make it the most racist, since after all, Maine has some of the best income equality for African Americans of anywhere in the United States, which is confusing considering the state's racist reputation. However, the facts do not lie. The state of Maine is in a drug overdose death crisis, one of the worst in the entire United States, and a state that's flooded with drugs can't possibly be on the list of safest places. Drug overdose death rates is an analytic that is overlooked by most people who compile safety lists, and I have to say it really shouldn't be overlooked because it gives a fairly accurate insight on the true state of safety in this state. And it's visible that the state has a drug problem. Driving along Interstate 95, most of the towns that we saw had a massive visible homeless population. And clearly, further inland towards Canada, the more isolated you get, the more harsh the winters get, it wouldn't make sense for those areas to have a huge homeless population. The people of Maine also seem to me fairly complacent in that most hospitality we ran into was subpar. The people here are kind of lazy, and if you go to hospitality in Maine, you're not going to find the cleanest hotel rooms even in the top brands. Hospitality here simply isn't a priority, despite the fact that rents are fairly affordable. The locals complain about low wages. Compare that to a state of Florida where the wages are lower and the rents double or triple. It really doesn't seem like the people in Maine have an appreciation for hard work. Usually safety correlates with a high standard of living, but when people aren't giving society their best, many times we use safety and high standard of living as interchangeable words. But when a place is considered safe, yet it doesn't have a high standard of living, it really puts up safety into question. Take this community here. The sign when you enter the town promotes it as a working coastal community. But judging by the condition of hygiene in the hotels we stayed at in Maine, it seems like the people here are lazier than people in places like Alabama and Mississippi, places that are usually not denoted for safety. Now, it's hard to draw a correlation between safety and hygiene analytically, but if you travel, you know what I'm talking about. Laziness, bad hygiene, high overdose death rates, all those types of things don't exactly point to a high standard of living, thus safety itself. And of course, no state is going to be exempt from having problems. But in the case of Maine, it either tends to be the extreme best or the extreme worst in many categories. And what a place like that would usually entail is that it's a great place for somebody. The factor is, are you compatible for the great things of Maine, or are you abhorred by their bad aspects? Maine reminds me of Hialeah, Florida. It's right next to Miami. It has some of the lowest murder rates in the entire state and in the entire country. But it also has some horrible categories of crime and other aspects of living, like high population density. And just like Hialeah has some great aspects, and on the other extreme, some horrible aspects, Maine tends to be the same way. In some areas, Maine is great, and in some areas, it's really pathetic. And that would only indicate that there's only a certain level of compatibility with somebody moving to the state. And if you're thinking about moving here just for its quote unquote safety factor, you may find other aspects of the state quite appalling. Of course, we all love safety. So when you see a state like Maine that's labeled one of the safest places in America, you automatically think, well, if I'm safe, I'll put up with all the other inconveniences. And I totally understand that. To a lot of us, safety becomes a priority in these scary times we're living in. So if we see a place that's labeled as being very safe, you'd think, well, as long as I'm safe, I'll put up with everything else that sucks about this place. But then you look at their overdose death rates and you're like, oh, this place is so depressing that the chances that somebody in your household could end up not only addicted, but eventually even dying from their addiction puts it into a different perspective. That safety is really superficial, and many of the residents reminisce about the time jobs were better, even though the condition of employment in their state isn't really as bad as in other places. Regardless of the safety factor, the standard of living in Maine absolutely sucks. Lines in restaurants and waiting times even to get a table are unacceptable. The people here simply are not putting any effort in their life. And if you're used to a higher standard of living, if you're coming from a state like Florida or California or Texas, where service is usually pretty good, you're going to find that dealing with the people here will make for a lot of distasteful experiences. Whether it was in hotels or restaurants, we found that almost everywhere we went, there was some type of hesitation due to the lack of effort of the people. They simply don't want to work, and that contributes to a very bad standard of living. And that's usually not something you associate with the Northeast. You have big cities, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. You expect that when you're in this region of the country, you're not going to have to deal with that type of backwards crap. So what is the compatibility for somebody moving to Maine? Now that we've established that safety shouldn't really be a factor in this state because of all its other inconveniences. The state has some beautiful natural settings. Along the coast, you have some of the most beautiful coastal communities in the United States. Heading further inland, mooses, big trees. Moving towards Canada, beautiful natural scenery. Many people in those small towns in the most remote regions enjoy activities like riding ATVs through the woods. That sounds like a lot of fun. But the state of Maine, having one of the smallest percentages of foreign-born population, chances are they're not going to be very friendly to outsiders. I can say that because I've lived in Alabama and Kentucky, two states that have a very low percentage of foreign-born population, and in both states, being an outsider, regardless of where you're coming from, feels a little uncomfortable. And I would say that your comfort level is somewhat related to your safety. And if you're looking for safety, you're probably also looking for comfort. And with the state having that situation of most of the people being from here, endemic to this area, how you will be perceived as an outsider is an interesting component on how you're going to perceive the safety of the state. For some people, safety and comfort are almost indistinguishable feelings, and if you are technically safe but you don't feel comfortable, you'll get the same types of emotions. With all that being said, I truly do not believe that Maine is the safest state. There's a lot of categories of safety that are many times overlooked with these online lists. They're looking simply at crime reports. But let's dig a little deeper into the situation of Maine. Here you have a state that despite being one of the safest states because they don't have a lot of arrests, also happens to have a massive drug problem. How can a place filled with drugs be considered one of the safest places to live? That simply doesn't make sense. The reality is that in Maine, law enforcement overlooks a lot of stuff. Possibly because most of the population is about the same demographic, they're all endemically from this place, there really isn't this crazy desire to go after people from law enforcement like you have in other states that are fueled a little differently. With my experience in Maine, it really didn't feel like the safest place I've ever been. It just felt like the place where law enforcement overlooked the most things. A sort of tolerance, if you will. If you do move to the state of Maine, you'll find natural beauty difficult to match anywhere in the United States. A calm, slow pace of life, and some of the best coastal settings you'll find anywhere in the country. And while Maine itself is a fairly featureless state, you're close to the largest cities in Canada and the largest cities in the United States if you don't mind a considerable drive. If you don't mind getting rid of the comforts like large brand companies and restaurants and all of the modern comforts of modern living, and you're okay with just nature itself, Maine could really be a good fit for you. If you're the type of person that misses living in the 1970s, I noticed that as soon as it got dark, it really felt lawless. Even in the country and rural areas, we saw people riding vehicles extraordinarily fast and recklessly. It just seems like the type of place where it's almost like you stepped back in time and you're back in 1995 again. Yes, there's less crime, or perhaps less attention to it. Life feels more wholesome in Maine, but also a lot of the comforts you're used to in a larger place are going to be absent. Besides that, looking at safety as a state as a whole is kind of deceptive. There's places in Maine that are very high crime rate. There's states that have high crime rates that have very safe areas. Your safety generally isn't as broad as an entire state. Your safety is usually more geographically confined. For example, I live in a very safe suburb. If I drive 15 minutes in one direction, I could be in a very dangerous place. If South Florida was its own state, we could almost argue that that would be just as safe as Maine. So when you include Central and North Florida, that the state's crime rate really goes out of hand. But nonetheless, like we said, Maine is surrounded by Canada, and as we know, Canada is much safer than the United States. Murder rates in Canada are a fraction of what they are in the United States, and Maine is surrounded by Canada. And it's almost like if a little piece of Canada belonged to the United States. I hope you guys have enjoyed my video, and if you're thinking about moving to Maine just because it quote-unquote is the safest state, you'll find that in some categories it really is safe. However, there's a lot more you need to look at. The whole time that I was in Maine, I was wondering, is this really the safest state? When you look at the state's drug problem and kind of lawless feel, it's hard to believe that it really is the safest state. Could it be a contender for the safest state? Quite possibly. But is it definitely without a doubt the safest state? I don't think so. Much like many southern states, I found the beauty of the state exceptional, but the people that I dealt with, especially along the 95 corridor, did not seem like an appealing place to me. You're combining the arrogance of New Englanders with the laziness of the South, two of the most undesirable aspects of American culture. While safety is important, it sure as crap is to me, there's a few other things you have to look at. For example, despite that I enjoy the safety of living in a nice suburb, I find myself constantly driving to bad neighborhoods to get food that isn't bland. And it's that blandness of Maine that may make your actual living experience kind of meaningless. Now, if you've got family and people you know and kind of a social network there, I would definitely say to go for it. But if you have no family ties or friendship ties to the state and you're going there without knowing anybody, there are probably much better options. I'm personally a fan of off-roading vehicles. I've had them in the past, and Maine seems like one of the best places to do so in the country. But I also know that there's a lawless nature that comes with this hobby that a lot of us may not see just driving down the main roads. I hope you've enjoyed my video. If you've lived in Maine or you've moved to Maine from somewhere else, I would love to hear your opinions. And if you're considering traveling to Maine, it really is one of the most beautiful places you're ever going to see. Just be a little patient with the hospitality. Don't have the highest expectations there. And while we did not see the moose that we really wanted to see while in Maine, well, we did get to see a moose carcass, so that'll have to do for now.